Chapter 22 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 22. The Major makes difficulties. As I opened the dining room door, the Major hastened to meet me. He looked the brightest and the youngest of living elderly gentlemen, with his smart blue frock coat, his winning smile, his ruby ring, and his ready compliment. It was quite cheering to meet the modern Don Juan once more. "I don't ask after your health," said the old gentleman. "Your eyes answer me, my dear lady, before I can put the question. At your age, a long sleep is the true beauty draught. Plenty of bed there is the simple secret of keeping your good looks and living a long life plenty of bed." "I have not been so long in my bed, Major, as you suppose. To tell the truth, I have been up all night reading." Major Fitz David lifted his well painted eyebrows in polite surprise. "What is the happy book which has interested you so deeply?" he asked. "The book," I answered, "is the Trial of my husband for the murder of his first wife." "Don't mention that horrid book!" he exclaimed. "Don't speak of that dreadful subject! What have beauty and grace to do with trials, poisonings, horrors? Why, my charming friend, profane your lips by talking of such things? Why frighten away the loves and the graces that lie hid in your smile? Humor an old fellow who adores the love and the graces, and who asks nothing better than to sun himself in your smiles. Luncheon is ready. Let us be cheerful. Let us laugh and lunch." He led me to the table, and filled my plate and my glass with the air of a man who considered himself to be engaged in one of the most important occupations of his life. Benjamin kept the conversation going in the interval. "Major Fitz David brings you some news, my dear," he said. "Your mother in law, Mrs. McKellen, is coming here to see you to day." My mother in law coming to see me! I turned eagerly to the Major for further information. "Has Mrs. Macallan heard anything of my husband?" I asked. "Is she coming here to tell me about him?" "She has heard of him, I believe," said the Major. "And she has also heard from your uncle the vicar. Our excellent Starkweather has written to her to what purpose I have not been informed. I only know that on receipt of his letter she has decided on paying you a visit. I met the old lady last night at a party, and I tried hard to discover whether she were coming to you as your friend or your enemy. My powers of persuasion were completely thrown away on her. The fact is," said the Major, speaking in the character of a youth of 25 making a modest confession, "I don't get on well with old women. Take the will for the deed, my sweet friend. I have tried to be of some use to you, and have failed." Those words offered me the opportunity for which I was waiting. I determined not to lose it. "You can be of the greatest use to me," I said, "if you will allow me to presume, Major, on your past kindness. I want to ask you a question, and I may have a favor to beg when you have answered me." Major Fitz David set down his wine glass on its way to his lips, and looked at me with an appearance of breathless interest. "Command me, my dear lady. I am yours and yours only," said the gallant old gentleman. "What do you wish to ask me?" "I wish to ask if you know Miserrimus Dexter." "Good Heavens!" cried the Major. "That is an unexpected question. Know Miserrimus Dexter! I have known him for more years than I like to reckon up. What can be your object?" "I can tell you what my object is in 2 words," I interposed. "I want you to give me an introduction to Miserrimus Dexter." My impression is that the Major turned pale under his paint. This, at any rate, is certain: his sparkling little gray eyes looked at me in undisguised bewilderment and alarm. "You want to know Miserrimus Dexter?" he repeated, with the air of a man who doubted the evidence of his own senses. "Mr. Benjamin, have I taken too much of your excellent wine? Am I the victim of a delusion? Or did our fair friend really ask me to give her an introduction to Miserrimus Dexter?" Benjamin looked at me in some bewilderment on his side, and answered quite seriously, "I think you said so, my dear." "I certainly said so," I rejoined. "What is there so very surprising in my request?" "The man is mad!" cried the Major. "In all England you could not have picked out a person more essentially unfit to be introduced to a lady to a young lady especially than Dexter. Have you heard of his horrible deformity?" "I have heard of it, and it doesn't daunt me." doesn't daunt you? My dear lady, the man's mind is as deformed as his body. What Voltaire said satirically of the character of his countrymen in general is literally true of Miserrimus Dexter. He is a mixture of the tiger and the monkey. At one moment he would frighten you, and at the next he would set you screaming with laughter. I don't deny that he is clever in some respects brilliantly clever, I admit. And I don't say that he has ever committed any acts of violence, or ever willingly injured anybody. But for all that, he is mad, if ever a man were mad yet. Forgive me if the inquiry is impertinent. What can your motive possibly be for wanting an introduction to Miserrimus Dexter?" "I want to consult him." "May I ask on what subject?" "On the subject of my husband's trial." Major Fitz David groaned, and sought a momentary consolation in his friend Benjamin's claret. "That dreadful subject again!" he exclaimed. "Mr. Benjamin, why does she persist in dwelling on that dreadful subject?" "I must dwell on what is now the one employment and the one hope of my life," I said. "I have reason to hope that Miserrimus Dexter can help me to clear my husband's character of the stain which the Scotch verdict has left on it. Tiger and monkey as he may be, I am ready to run the risk of being introduced to him. And I ask you again, rashly and obstinately as I fear you will think, to give me the introduction. It will put you to no inconvenience. I won't trouble you to escort me. A letter to Mr. Dexter will do." The Major looked piteously at Benjamin, and shook his head. Benjamin looked piteously at the Major, and shook his head. "She appears to insist on it," said the Major. "Yes," said Benjamin, "she appears to insist on it. I won't take the responsibility, Mr. Benjamin, of sending her alone to Miserrimus Dexter. Shall I go with her, sir?" The Major reflected. Benjamin, in the capacity of protector, did not appear to inspire our military friend with confidence. After a moment's consideration, a new idea seemed to strike him. He turned to me. "My charming friend," he said, "be more charming than ever, consent to a compromise. Let us treat this difficulty about Dexter from a social point of view. What do you say to a little dinner?" "A little dinner?" I repeated, not in the least understanding him. "A little dinner," the Major reiterated, "at my house. You insist on my introducing you to Dexter, and I refuse to trust you alone with that crack brained personage. The only alternative, under the circumstances, is to invite him to meet you, and to let you form your own opinion of him under the protection of my roof. Who shall we have to meet you besides?" pursued the Major, brightening with hospitable intentions. "We want a perfect galaxy of beauty around the table, as a species of compensation when we have got Miserrimus Dexter as one of the guests. Madame Mirliflore is still in London. You would be sure to like her. She is charming. She possesses your firmness, your extraordinary tenacity of purpose. Yes, we will have Madame Mirliflore. Who else? Shall we say Lady Clarinda? Another charming person, Mr. Benjamin. You would be sure to admire her, she is so sympathetic. She resembles in so many respects our fair friend here. Yes, Lady Clarinda shall be one of us, and you shall sit next to her, Mr. Benjamin, as a proof of my sincere regard for you. Shall we have my young prima donna to sing to us in the evening? I think so. She is pretty. She will assist in obscuring the deformity of Dexter. Very well, there's our party complete. I will shut myself up this evening, and approach the question of dinner with my cook. Shall we say this day week?" asked the Major, taking out his pocket-book. "At 8 o'clock?" I consented to the proposed compromise, but not very willingly. With a letter of introduction, I might have seen Miserrimus Dexter that afternoon. As it was, the little dinner compelled me to wait in absolute inaction through a whole week. However, there was no help for it but to submit. Major Fitz David, in his polite way, could be as obstinate as I was. He had evidently made up his mind, and further opposition on my part would be of no service to me. "Punctually at 8, Mr. Benjamin," reiterated the Major. "Put it down in your book." Benjamin obeyed, with a side look at me, which I was at no loss to interpret. My good old friend did not relish meeting a man at dinner who was described as half tiger, half monkey; and the privilege of sitting next to Lady Clarinda rather daunted than delighted him. It was all my doing, and he too had no choice but to submit. "Punctually at 8, sir," said poor old Benjamin, obediently recording his formidable engagement. "Please to take another glass of wine." The Major looked at his watch and rose, with fluent apologies for abruptly leaving the table. "It is later than I thought," he said. "I have an appointment with a friend a female friend a most attractive person. You a little remind me of her, my dear lady you resemble her in complexion the same creamy paleness. I adore creamy paleness. As I was saying, I have an appointment with my friend. She does me the honor to ask my opinion on some very remarkable specimens of old lace. I have studied old lace. I study everything that can make me useful or agreeable to your enchanting sex. You won't forget our little dinner? I will send Dexter his invitation the moment I get home." He took my hand, and looked at it critically, with his head a little on one side. "A delicious hand," he said. "You don't mind me looking at it? You don't mind my kissing it, do you? A delicious hand is one of my weaknesses. Forgive my weaknesses. I promise to repent and amend one of these days." "At your age, Major, do you think you have much time to lose?" asked a strange voice, speaking behind us. We all three looked around toward the door. There stood my husband's mother, smiling satirically, with Benjamin's shy little maid servant waiting to announce her. Major Fitz David was ready with his answer. The old soldier was not easily taken by surprise. "Age, my dear Mrs. Macallan, is a purely relative expression," he said. "There are some people who are never young, and there are other people who are never old. I am one of the other people. Au revoir." With that answer, the incorrigible Major kissed the tips of his fingers to us and walked out. Benjamin, bowing with his old fashioned courtesy, threw open the door of his little library, and, inviting Mrs. Macallan and myself to pass in, left us together in the room. Chapter 23. Of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 23. My mother-in-law surprises me. I took a chair at a respectful distance from the sofa on which Mrs. Macallan seated herself. The old lady smiled, and beckoned to me to take my place by her side. Judging by appearances, she had certainly not come to see me in the character of an enemy. It remained to be discovered whether she were really disposed to be my friend. "I have received a letter from your uncle the vicar," she began. "He asks me to visit you, and I am, for reasons which you shall presently hear, to comply with his request. Under other circumstances, I doubt very much, my dear child, strange as the confession may appear, whether I should have ventured into your presence. My son has behaved to you so weakly, and, in my opinion, so inexcusably, that I am really, speaking as his mother, almost ashamed to face you." Was she in earnest? I listened to her, and looked at her in amazement. "Your uncle's letter," pursued Mrs. Macallan, "tells me how you have behaved under your hard trial, and what you propose to do now Eustace has left you. Dr. Starkweather, poor man, seems to be inexpressibly shocked by what you said to him when he was in London. He begs me to use my influence to induce you to abandon your present ideas, and to make you return to your old home in the vicarage. I don't in the least agree with your uncle, my dear. Wild as I believe your plans to be, you have not the slightest chance of succeeding in carrying them out. I admire your courage, your fidelity, your unshaken faith in my unhappy son, after his unpardonable behavior to you. You are a fine creature, Valeria, and I have come here to tell you so in plain words. Give me a kiss, child. You deserve to be the wife of a hero, and you have married one of the weakest of living mortals. God forgive me for speaking so of my own son, but it's in my mind, and it must come out." This way of speaking of Eustace was more than I could suffer, even from his mother. I recovered the use of my tongue in my husband's defense. "I am sincerely proud of your good opinion, dear Mrs. Macallan," I said. "But you distress me forgive me if I own it plainly when I hear you speak so despairingly of Eustace. I cannot agree with you that my husband is the weakest of living mortals." "Of course not!" retorted the lady. "You are like all good women you make a hero of the man you love, whether he deserves it or not. Your husband has hosts of good qualities, child and perhaps I know them better than you do. But his whole conduct, from the moment when he first entered your uncle's house to the present time, has been, I say again, the conduct of an essentially weak man. What do you think he has done now by way of climax? He has joined a charitable brotherhood, and he is off to the war in Spain with a red cross on his arm, when he ought to be here on his knees, asking his wife to forgive him. I say that is the conduct of a weak man. Some people might call it by a harder name." This news startled and distressed me. I might be resigned to his leaving me for a time, but all my instincts as a woman revolted at his placing himself in a position of danger during his separation from his wife. He had now deliberately added to my anxieties. I thought it cruel of him, but I would not confess what I thought to his mother. I affected to be as cool as she was, and disputed her conclusions with all the firmness that I could summon to help me. The terrible old woman only went on abusing him more vehemently than ever. "What I complain of in my son," proceeded Mrs. Macallan, "is that he has entirely failed to understand you. If he had married a fool, his conduct would be intelligible enough. He would have done wisely to conceal from a fool that he had been married already, and that he had suffered the horrid public exposure of a trial for the murder of his wife. Then, again, he would have been quite right, when this same fool had discovered the truth, to take himself out of her way before she could suspect him of poisoning her, for the sake of the peace and quiet of both parties. But you are not a fool. I can see that after only a short experience of you. Why can't he see it too? Why didn't he trust you with his secret from the first, instead of stealing his way into your affections under an assumed name? Why did he plan, as he confessed to me, to take you away to the Mediterranean, and to keep you abroad, for fear of some officious friends at home betraying him to you as the prisoner of the famous trial? What is the plain answer to all these questions? What is the one possible explanation of this otherwise unaccountable conduct? There is only one answer and one explanation. My poor wretched son he takes after his father, he isn't the least like me is weak. Weak in his way of judging, weak in his way of acting, and, like all weak people, headstrong and unreasonable to the last degree. There is the truth. Don't get red and angry. I am as fond of him as you are. I can see his merits too. And one of them is that he has married a woman of spirit and resolution, so faithful and so fond of him that she won't even let his own mother tell her of his faults. Good child, I like you for hating me." "Dear madam, don't say that I hate you!" I exclaimed, feeling very much as if I did hate her, though, for all that. "I only presume to think that you are confusing a delicate minded man with a weak minded man. Our dear unhappy Eustace " "Is a delicate minded man," said the impenetrable Mrs. Macallan, finishing my sentence for me. "We will leave it there, my dear, and get on to another subject. I wonder whether we shall disagree about that too?" "What is the subject, madam?" "I won't tell you if you call me madam. Call me mother. Say, what is the subject, mother?" "Your notion of turning yourself into a court of appeal for a new trial of Eustace, and forcing the world to pronounce a just verdict on him. Do you really mean to try it?" "I do." Mrs. Macallan considered for a moment grimly with herself. "You know how heartily I admire your courage, and your devotion to my unfortunate son," she said. "You know by this time that I don't cant. But I cannot see you attempt to perform impossibilities. I cannot let you uselessly risk your reputation and your happiness without warning you before it is too late. My child, the thing you have got it in your head to do is not to be done by you or by anybody. Give it up." "I am deeply obliged to you, Mrs. Macallan." "Mother!" "I am deeply obliged to you, mother, for the interest that you take in me, but I cannot give it up. Right or wrong, risk or no risk, I must and I will try it." Mrs. Macallan looked at me very attentively, and sighed to herself. "Oh, youth, youth!" she said to herself, sadly. "What a grand thing it is to be young!" She controlled the rising regret, and turned on me suddenly, almost fiercely, with these words: "What in God's name do you mean to do?" At the instant when she put the question, the idea crossed my mind that Mrs. Macallan could introduce me, if she pleased, to Miserrimus Dexter. She must know him, and know him well, as a guest at Gleninch, and an old friend of her son. "I mean to consult Miserrimus Dexter," I answered, boldly. Mrs. Macallan started back from me with a loud exclamation of surprise. "Are you out of your senses?" she asked. I told her, as I had told Major Fitz David, that I had reason to think Mr. Dexter's advice might be of real assistance to me at starting. "And I," rejoined Mrs. Macallan, "have reason to think that the whole project is a mad one, and that in asking Dexter's advice on it you appropriately consult a madman. You needn't start, child. There is no harm in the creature. I don't mean that he will attack you, or be rude to you. I only say that the last person whom a young woman, placed in your painful and delicate position, ought to associate herself with is Miserrimus Dexter." Strange! Here was the Major's warning repeated by Mrs. Macallan almost in the Major's own words. Well, it shared the fate of most warnings. It only made me more and more eager to have my own way. "You surprise me very much," I said. "Mr. Dexter's evidence, given at the Trial, seems as clear and reasonable as evidence can be." "Of course it is," answered Mrs. Macallan. "The shorthand writers and reporters put his evidence into presentable language before they printed it. If you had heard what he really said, as I did, you would have been either very much disgusted with him or very much amused by him, according to your way of looking at things. He began, fairly enough, with a modest explanation of his absurd Christian name, which at once checked the merriment of the audience. But as he went on, the mad side of him showed itself. He mixed up sense and nonsense in the strangest confusion. He was called to order over and over again. He was even threatened with fine and imprisonment for contempt of court. In short, he was just like himself, a mixture of the strangest and the most opposite qualities. At one time perfectly clear and reasonable, as you said just now; at another breaking out into rhapsodies of the most outrageous kind, like a man in a state of delirium. A more entirely unfit person to advise anybody, I tell you again, never lived. You don't expect me to introduce you to him, I hope?" "I did think of such a thing," I answered. "But after what you have said, dear Mrs. Macallan, I give up the idea, of course. It is not a great sacrifice. It only obliges me to wait a week for Major Fitz David's dinner party. He has promised to ask Miserrimus Dexter to meet me." "There is the Major all over!" cried the old lady. "If you pin your faith on that man, I pity you. He is as slippery as an eel. I suppose you asked him to introduce you to Dexter?" "Yes." "Exactly. Dexter despises him, my dear. He knows as well as I do that Dexter won't go to his dinner. And he takes that roundabout way of keeping you apart, instead of saying No to you plainly, like an honest man." This was bad news. But I was, as usual, too obstinate to own myself defeated. "If the worst comes to the worst," I said, "I can but write to Mr. Dexter, and beg him to grant me an interview." "And go to him by yourself, if he does grant it?" inquired Mrs. Macallan. "Certainly, by myself." "You really mean it?" "I do indeed." "I won't allow you to go by yourself." "May I venture to ask, ma'am, how you propose to prevent me?" "By going with you, to be sure, you obstinate hussy! Yes, yes, I can be as headstrong as you are when I like. Mind, I don't want to know what your plans are. I don't want to be mixed up with your plans. My son is resigned to the Scotch verdict. I am resigned to the Scotch verdict. It is you who won't let matters rest as they are. You are a vain and foolhardy young person. But, somehow, I have taken a liking to you, and I won't let you go to Miserrimus Dexter by yourself. Put on your bonnet." "Now?" I asked. "Certainly. My carriage is at the door; and the sooner it's over the better I shall be pleased. Get ready, and be quick about it." I required no second bidding. In 10 minutes more we were on our way to Miserrimus Dexter. Such was the result of my mother in law's visit. End of Chapter 23. Of the Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 24. Miserrimus Dexter. First View. We had dawdled over our luncheon before Mrs. Macallan arrived at Benjamin's cottage. The ensuing conversation between the old lady and myself, of which I have only presented a brief abstract, lasted until quite late in the afternoon. The sun was setting in heavy clouds when we got into the carriage, and the autumn twilight began to fall around us while we were still on the road. The direction in which we drove took us, as well as I could judge, toward the great northern suburb of London. For more than an hour the carriage threaded its way through a dingy brick labyrinth of streets, growing smaller and smaller, and dirtier, the further we went. Emerging from the labyrinth, I noticed in the gathering darkness dreary patches of waste ground which seemed to be neither town nor country. Crossing these, we passed some forlorn outlying groups of houses, with dim little scattered shops among them, looking lost, like country villages wandering on the way to London, disfigured and smoke dried already by their journey. Darker and drearier the prospect grew, until the carriage stopped at last, and Mrs. Macallan announced, in her sharply satirical way, that we had reached the end of our journey. "Prince Dexter's Palace, my dear," she said. "What do you think of it?" I looked around me, not knowing what to think of it, if the truth must be told. We had got out of the carriage, and we were standing on a rough, half made gravel path. Right and left of me, in the dim light, I saw the half completed foundations of new houses in their first stage of existence. Boards and bricks were scattered about us. At places gaunt scaffolding poles rose like the branchless trees of the brick desert. Behind us, on the other side of the high road, stretched another plot of waste ground, as yet not built on. Over the surface of this second desert the ghostly white figures of vagrant ducks gleamed at intervals in the mystic light. In front of us, at a distance of 200 yards or so, as well as I could calculate, rose a black mass, which gradually resolved itself, as my eyes became accustomed to the twilight, into a long, low, and ancient house, with a hedge of evergreens and a pitch-black paling in front of it. The footman led the way toward the paling, through the boards and the bricks, the oyster shells and the broken crockery that strewed the ground. And this was Prince Dexter's Palace. There was a gate in the pitch-black paling, and a bell-handle, discovered with great difficulty. Pulling at the handle, the footman set in motion, to judge by the sound produced, a bell of prodigious size, fitter for a church than a house. While we were waiting for admission, Mrs. Macallan pointed to the low, dark line of the old building. "There is one of his madnesses," she said. "The speculators in this new neighborhood have offered him I don't know how many £1,000 for the ground that house stands on. It was originally the manor house of the district. Dexter purchased it, many years since, in one of his freaks of fancy. He has no old family associations with the place; the walls are all but tumbling about his ears, and the money offered would really be of use to him. But no! He refused the proposal of the enterprising speculators by letters in these words: 'My house is standing monument of the picturesque and beautiful, amid the mean, dishonest, and groveling constructions of a mean, dishonest, and groveling age. I keep my house, gentlemen, as a useful lesson to you. Look at it while you are building around me, and blush, if you can, for your work.' Was there ever such an absurd letter written yet? Hush! I hear footsteps in the garden. Here comes his cousin. His cousin is a woman. I may as well tell you that, for you might mistake her for a man in the dark." A rough, deep voice, which I should certainly never have supposed to be the voice of a woman, hailed us from the inner side of the paling. "Who's there?" "Mrs. Macallan," answered my mother in law. "What do you want?" "We want to see Dexter." "You can't see him." "Why not?" "What did you say your name was?" "Macallan. Mrs. Macallan. Eustace Macallan's mother. Now do you understand?" The voice muttered and grunted behind the paling, and a key turned in the lock of the gate. Admitted to the garden in the deep shadow of the shrubs, I could see nothing distinctly of the woman with the rough voice, except that she wore a man's hat. Closing the gate behind us, without a word of welcome or explanation, she led the way to the house. Mrs. Macallan followed her easily, knowing the place; and I walked in Mrs. Macallan's footsteps as closely as I could. "This is a nice family," my mother in law whispered to me. "Dexter's cousin is the only woman in the house, and Dexter's cousin is an idiot." We entered a spacious hall with a low ceiling, dimly lighted at its further end by one small oil lamp. I could see that there were pictures on the grim brown walls, but the subjects represented were invisible in the obscure and shadowy light. Mrs. Macallan addressed herself to the speechless cousin with the man's hat. "Now tell me," she said, "why can't we see Dexter?" The cousin took a sheet of paper off the table, and handed it to Mrs. Macallan. "The Master's frightened," said the strange creature, in a hoarse whisper, as if the bare idea of "the Master" terrified her. "Read it, and stay or go, which you please." She opened an invisible side door in the wall, masked by one of the pictures, disappeared through it like a ghost, and left us together alone in the hall. Mrs. Macallan approached the oil lamp, and looked by its light at the sheet of paper which the woman had given to her. I followed, and peeped over her shoulder without ceremony. The paper exhibited written characters, traced in a wonderfully large and firm handwriting. Had I caught the infection of madness in the air of the house, or did I really see before me these words: "Notice. My immense imagination is at work. Visions of heroes unroll themselves before me. I reanimate in myself the spirits of the departed great. My brains are boiling in my head. Any persons who disturb me, under existing circumstances, will do it at the peril of their lives. Dexter." Mrs. Macallan looked around at me quietly with her sardonic smile. "Do you still persist in wanting to be introduced to him?" she asked. The mockery in the tone of the question roused my pride. I determined that I would not be the first to give way. "Not if I am putting you in peril of your life, ma'am," I answered, pertly enough, pointing to the paper in her hand. My mother in law returned to the hall table, and put the paper back on it without condescending to reply. She then led the way to an arched recess on our right hand, beyond which I dimly discerned a broad flight of oaken stairs. "Follow me," said Mrs. Macallan, mounting the stairs in the dark. "I know where to find him." We groped our way up the stairs to the first landing. The next flight of steps, turning in the reverse direction, was faintly illuminated, like the hall below, by one oil lamp, placed in some invisible position above us. Ascending the second flight of stairs, and crossing a short corridor, we discovered the lamp through the open door of a quaintly shaped circular room, burning on the mantelpiece. Its light illuminated a strip of thick tapestry, hanging loose from the ceiling to the floor on the wall opposite to the door by which we had entered. Mrs. Macallan drew aside the strip of tapestry, and, signing me to follow her, passed behind it. "Listen," she whispered. Standing on the inner side of the tapestry, I found myself in a dark recess or passage, at the end of which a ray of light from the lamp showed me a closed door. I listened, and heard on the other side of the door a shouting voice, accompanied by an extraordinary rumbling and whistling sound, traveling backward and forward, as well as I could judge, over a great space. Now the rumbling and the whistling would reach their climax of loudness, and would overcome the resonant notes of the shouting voice. Then again their louder sounds gradually retreated into distance, and the shouting voice made itself heard as the more audible sound of the two. The door must have been of prodigious solidity. Listen as intently as I might, I failed to catch the articulate words, if any, which the voice was pronouncing, and I was equally at a loss to penetrate the cause which produced the rumbling and whistling sounds. "What can possibly be going on," I whispered to Mrs. Macallan, "on the other side of that door?" "Step softly," my mother in law answered, "and come and see." She arranged the tapestry behind us so as completely to shut out the light in the circular room. Then, noiselessly turning the handle, she opened the heavy door. We kept ourselves concealed in the shadow of the recess, and looked through the open doorway. I saw, or fancied I saw in the obscurity, a long room with a low ceiling. The dying gleam of an ill kept fire formed the only light by which I could judge of objects and distances. Redly illuminating the central portion of the room, opposite to which we were standing, the firelight left the extremities shadowed in almost total darkness. I had barely time to notice this before I heard the rumbling and whistling sounds approaching me. A high chair on wheels moved by, through the field of red light, carrying a shadowy figure with floating hair, and arms furiously raised and lowered working the machinery that propelled the chair at its utmost rate of speed. "I am Napoleon, at the sunrise of Austerlitz!" shouted the man in the chair, as he swept past me on his rumbling and whistling wheels in the red glow of the firelight. I give the word, and thrones rock, and kings fall, and nations tremble, and men by tens of thousands fight and bleed and die." The chair rushed out of sight, and the shouting man in it became another hero. "I am Nelson," the ringing voice cried now. "I am leading the fleet at Trafalgar. I issue my commands, prophetically conscious of victory and death. I see my own apotheosis, my public funeral, my nation's tears, my burial in the glorious church. The ages remember me, and the poets sing my praise in immortal verse." The strident wheels turned at the far end of the room, and came back. The fantastic and frightful apparition, man and machinery blended in one, the new centaur, half man, half chair, flew by me again in the dying light. "I am Shakespeare!" cried the frantic creature now. "I am writing Lear, the tragedy of tragedies. Ancients and moderns, I am the poet who towers over them all. Light! Light! The lines flow out like lava from the eruption of my volcanic mind. Light! Light! For the poet of all time to write the words that live forever." He ground and tore his way back toward the middle of the room. As he approached the fireplace, a last morsel of unburned coal, or wood, burst into momentary flame, and showed the open doorway. In that moment he saw us. The wheeled chair stopped with a shock that shook the crazy old floor of the room, altered its course, and flew at us with the rush of a wild animal. We drew back, just in time to escape it, against the wall of the recess. The chair passed on, and burst aside the hanging tapestry. The light of the lamp in the circular room poured in through the gap. The creature in the chair checked his furious wheels, and looked back over his shoulder with an impish curiosity horrible to see. "Have I run over them? Have I ground them to powder for presuming to intrude on me?" he said to himself. As the expression of this amiable doubt passed his lips, his eyes lighted on us. His mind instantly veered back again to Shakespeare and King Lear. "Goneril and Regan!" he cried. "My two unnatural daughters, my she-devil children, come to mock at me!" "Nothing of the sort," said my mother-in-law, as quietly as if she were addressing a perfectly reasonable being. "I am your old friend, Mrs. Macallan, and I have brought Eustace Macallan's second wife to see you." The instant she pronounced those last words, Eustace Macallan's second wife, the man in the chair sprang out of it with a shrill cry of horror, as if she had shot him. For one moment we saw a head and body in the air, absolutely deprived of the lower limbs. The moment after, the terrible creature touched the floor as lightly as a monkey on his hands. The grotesque horror of the scene culminated in his hopping away on his hands, at a prodigious speed, until he reached the fireplace in the long room. There he crouched over the dying embers, shuddering and shivering, and muttering, "Oh, pity me," dozens and dozens of times to himself. This was the man whose advice I had come to ask, whose assistance I had confidently counted on in my hour of need. Chapter 25. Of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady, by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 25. Miserrimus Dexter, Second View. Thoroughly disheartened and disgusted, and, if I must confess it, thoroughly frightened too, I whispered to Mrs. Macallan, "I was wrong, and you were right. Let us go." The ears of Miserrimus Dexter must have been as sensitive as the ears of a dog. He heard me say, "Let us go." "No!" he called out. "Bring Eustace Macallan's second wife in here. I am a gentleman. I must apologize to her. I am a student of human character. I wish to see her." The whole man appeared to have undergone a complete transformation. He spoke in the gentlest of voices, and he sighed hysterically when he had done, like a woman recovering from a burst of tears. Was it reviving courage or reviving curiosity? When Mrs. Macallan said to me, "The fit is over now. Do you still wish to go away?" I answered, "No, I am ready to go in." "Have you recovered your belief in him already?" asked my mother in law, in her mercilessly satirical way. "I have recovered from my terror of him," I replied. "I am sorry I terrified you," said the soft voice at the fireplace. Some people think I am a little mad at times. You came, I suppose, at one of the times if some people are right. I admit that I am a visionary. My imagination runs away with me, and I say and do strange things. On those occasions, anybody who reminds me of that horrible trial throws me back again into the past, and causes me unutterable nervous suffering. I am a very tender hearted man. As the necessary consequence, in such a world as this, I am a miserable wretch. Accept my excuses. Come in, both of you. Come in and pity me." A child would not have been frightened of him now. A child would have gone in and pitied him. The room was getting darker and darker. We could just see the crouching figure of Miserrimus Dexter at the expiring fire and that was all. "Are we to have no light?" asked Mrs. Macallan. "And is this lady to see you, when the light comes, out of your chair?" He lifted something bright and metallic, hanging round his neck, and blew on it a series of shrill, trilling, bird like notes. After an interval he was answered by a similar series of notes, sounding faintly in some distant region of the house. "Ariel is coming," he said. "Compose yourself, Mamma Macallan. Ariel will make me presentable to a lady's eyes." He hopped away on his hands into the darkness at the end of the room. "Wait a little," said Mrs. Macallan, "and you will have another surprise. You will see the delicate Ariel." We heard heavy footsteps in the circular room. "Ariel," sighed Miserrimus Dexter out of the darkness, in his softest notes. To my astonishment, the coarse masculine voice of the cousin in the man's hat, the Caliban's rather than the Ariel's voice, answered, "Here." "My chair, Ariel." The person thus strangely misnamed drew aside the tapestry, so as to let in more light, then entered the room, pushing the wheeled chair before her. She stooped and lifted Miserrimus Dexter from the floor, like a child. Before she could put him into the chair, he sprang out of her arms with a little gleeful cry, and alighted on his seat, like a bird alighting on its perch. "The lamp," said Miserrimus Dexter, "and the looking glass. Pardon me," he added, addressing us, "for turning my back on you. You mustn't see me until my hair is set to rights. Ariel, the brush, the comb, and the perfumes." Carrying the lamp in one hand, the looking glass in the other, and the brush, with the comb stuck in it, between her teeth, Ariel the second, otherwise Dexter's cousin, presented herself plainly before me for the first time. I could now see the girl's round, fleshy, inexpressive face, her rayless and colorless eyes, her coarse nose and heavy chin. A creature half alive, an imperfectly developed animal in shapeless form, clad in a man's pilot jacket, and treading in a man's heavy laced boots, with nothing but an old red flannel petticoat and a broken comb in her frowsy flaxen hair to tell us that she was a woman. Such was the inhospitable person who had received us in the darkness when we first entered the house. This wonderful valet, collecting her materials for dressing her still more wonderful master's hair, gave him the looking glass, a hand mirror, and addressed herself to her work. She combed, she brushed, she oiled, she perfumed the flowing locks and the long silky beard of Miserrimus Dexter with the strangest mixture of dullness and dexterity that I ever saw. Done in brute silence, with a lumpish look and a clumsy gait, the work was perfectly well done, nevertheless. The imp in the chair superintended the whole proceeding critically by means of his hand mirror. He was too deeply interested in this occupation to speak until some of the concluding touches to his beard brought the misnamed Ariel in front of him, and so turned her full face toward the part of the room in which Mrs. Macallan and I were standing. Then he addressed us, taking especial care, however, not to turn his head our way while his toilet was still incomplete. "Mamma Macallan," he said, "what is the Christian name of your son's second wife?" "Why do you want to know?" asked my mother in law. "I want to know because I can't address her as Mrs. Eustace Macallan." "Why not?" "It recalls the other Mrs. Eustace Macallan. If I am reminded of those horrible days at Gleninch my fortitude will give way. I shall burst out screaming again." Hearing this, I hastened to interpose. "My name is Valeria," I said. "A Roman name," remarked Miserrimus Dexter. "I like it. My mind is cast in the Roman mold. My bodily build would have been Roman if I had been born with legs. I shall call you Mrs. Valeria, unless you disapprove of it." I hastened to say that I was far from disapproving of it. "Very good," said Miserrimus Dexter. "Mrs. Valeria, do you see the face of this creature in front of me?" He pointed with the hand mirror to his cousin as unconcernedly as he might have pointed to a dog. His cousin, on her side, took no more notice than a dog would have taken of the contemptuous phrase by which he had designated her. She went on combing and oiling his beard as composedly as ever. "It is the face of an idiot, isn't it?" pursued Miserrimus Dexter. "Look at her! She's a mere vegetable. A cabbage in a garden has as much life and expression in it as that girl exhibits at the present moment. Would you believe there was latent intelligence, affection, pride, fidelity, in such a half developed being as this?" I was really ashamed to answer him. Quite needlessly, the impenetrable young woman went on with her master's beard. A machine could not have taken less notice of the life and the talk around it than this incomprehensible creature. "I have got at that latent affection, pride, fidelity, and the rest of it," resumed Miserrimus Dexter. "I hold the key to that dormant intelligence. Grand thought! Now look at her when I speak. I named her, poor wretch, in one of my ironical moments. She has got to like her name, just as a dog gets to like his collar. Now, Mrs. Valeria, look and listen. Ariel!" The girl's dull face began to brighten. The girl's mechanically moving hand stopped, and held the comb in suspense. "Ariel, you have learned to dress my hair and anoint my beard, haven't you?" Her face still brightened. "Yes, yes, yes," she answered eagerly. "And you say I have learned to do it well, don't you?" "I say that. Would you like to let anybody else do it for you?" Her eyes melted softly into light and fire. Her strange, unwomanly voice sank to the gentlest tones that I had heard from her yet. "Nobody else shall do it for me," she said at once proudly and tenderly. "Nobody, as long as I live, shall touch you but me." "Not even the lady there?" asked Miserrimus Dexter, pointing backward with his hand mirror to the place at which I was standing. Her eyes suddenly flashed. Her hand suddenly shook the comb at me in a burst of jealous rage. "Let her try!" cried the poor creature, raising her voice again to its hoarsest notes. "Let her touch you if she dares!" Dexter laughed at the childish outbreak. "That will do, my delicate Ariel," he said. "I dismiss your intelligence for the present. Relapse into your former self. Finish my beard." She passively resumed her work. The new light in her eyes, the new expression in her face, faded little by little and died out. In another minute the face was as vacant and as lumpish as before. The hands did their work again with the lifeless dexterity which had so painfully impressed me when she first took up the brush. Miserrimus Dexter appeared to be perfectly satisfied with these results. "I thought my little experiment might interest you," he said. "You see how it is? The dormant intelligence of my curious cousin is like the dormant sound in a musical instrument. I play upon it, and it answers to my touch. She likes being played upon. But her great delight is to hear me tell a story. I puzzle her to the verge of distraction, and the more I confuse her the better she likes the story. It is the greatest fun you really must see it some day." He indulged himself in a last look at the mirror. "Ha!" he said, complacently. "Now I shall do. Vanish, Ariel." She tramped out of the room in her heavy boots, with the mute obedience of a trained animal. I said "Good night" as she passed me. She neither returned the salutation nor looked at me; the words simply produced no effect on her dull senses. The one voice that could reach her was silent. She had relapsed once more into the vacant inanimate creature who had opened the gate to us, until it pleased Miserrimus Dexter to speak to her again. "Valeria," said my mother in law, "our modest host is waiting to see what you think of him." While my attention was fixed on his cousin, he had wheeled his chair around so as to face me with the light of the lamp falling full on him. In mentioning his appearance as a witness at the Trial, I find I have borrowed, without meaning to do so, from my experience of him at this later time. I saw plainly now the bright intelligent face, and the large clear blue eyes, the lustrous waving hair of a light chestnut color, the long delicate white hands, and the magnificent throat and chest which I have elsewhere described. The deformity which degraded and destroyed the manly beauty of his head and breast was hidden from view by an Oriental robe of many colors, thrown over the chair like a coverlet. He was clothed in a jacket of black velvet, fastened loosely across his chest with large malachite buttons, and he wore lace ruffles at the ends of his sleeves, in the fashion of the last century. It may well have been due to want of perception on my part, but I could see nothing mad in him, nothing in any way repelling, as he now looked at me. The one defect that I could discover in his face was at the outer corners of his eyes, just under the temple. Here, when he laughed, and in a lesser degree when he smiled, the skin contracted into quaint little wrinkles and folds which looked strangely out of harmony with the almost youthful appearance of the rest of his face. As to his other features, the mouth, so far as his beard and moustache permitted me to see it, was small and delicately formed. The nose, perfectly shaped on the straight Grecian model, was perhaps a little too thin, judged by comparison with the full cheeks and the high massive forehead. Looking at him as a whole, and speaking of him, of course, from a woman's, not a physiognomist's point of view, I can only describe him as being an unusually handsome man. A painter would have revelled in him as a model for St. John; and a young girl, ignorant of what the Oriental robe hid from view, would have said to herself, the instant she looked at him, "Here is the hero of my dreams." His blue eyes large as the eyes of a woman, clear as the eyes of a child rested on me the moment I turned toward him with a strangely varying play of expression which at once interested and perplexed me. Now there was doubt, uneasy, painful doubt, in the look; and now again it changed brightly to approval, so open and unrestrained that a vain woman might have fancied she had made a conquest of him at first sight. Suddenly a new emotion seemed to take possession of him. His eyes sank, his head drooped; he lifted his hands with a gesture of regret. He muttered and murmured to himself, pursuing some secret and melancholy train of thought which seemed to lead him further and further away from present objects of interest, and to plunge him deeper and deeper in troubled recollections of the past. Here and there I caught some of the words. Little by little I found myself trying to fathom what was darkly passing in this strange man's mind. "A far more charming face," I heard him say. "But no, not a more beautiful figure." What figure was ever more beautiful than hers? Something, but not all, of her enchanting grace? Where is the resemblance which has brought her back to me? In the pose of the figure, perhaps. In the movement of the figure, perhaps. Poor martyred angel, what a life, and what a death! What a death! Was he comparing me with the victim of the poison? With my husband's first wife? His words seemed to justify the conclusion. If I were right, the dead woman had evidently been a favorite with him. There was no misinterpreting the broken tones of his voice when he spoke of her. He had admired her living, he mourned her dead. Supposing that I could prevail upon myself to admit this extraordinary person into my confidence, what would be the result? Should I be the gainer or the loser by the resemblance which he fancied he had discovered? Would the sight of me console him or pain him? I waited eagerly to hear more on the subject of the first wife. Not a word more escaped his lips. A new change came over him. He lifted his head with a start, and looked about him as a weary man might look if he was suddenly disturbed in a deep sleep. "What have I done?" he said. "Have I been letting my mind drift again?" He shuddered and sighed. "Oh, that house of Gleninch!" he murmured sadly to himself. "Shall I never get away from it in my thoughts? Oh, that house of Gleninch!" To my infinite disappointment, Mrs. Macallan checked the further revelation of what was passing in his mind. Something in the tone and manner of his allusion to her son's country house seemed to have offended her. She interposed sharply and decisively. "Gently, my friend, gently," she said. "I don't think you quite know what you are talking about." His great blue eyes flashed at her fiercely. With one turn of his hand he brought his chair close at her side. The next instant he caught her by the arm, and forced her to bend to him, until he could whisper in her ear. He was violently agitated. His whisper was loud enough to make itself heard where I was sitting at the time. "I don't know what I am talking about," he repeated, with his eyes fixed attentively, not on my mother in law, but on me. "You short sighted old woman! Where are your spectacles? Look at her. Do you see no resemblance? The figure, not the face. Do you see no resemblance there to Eustace's first wife?" "Pure fancy," rejoined Mrs. Macallan. "I see nothing of the sort." He shook her impatiently. "Not so loud," he whispered. "She will hear you." "I have heard you both," I said. You need have no fear, Mr. Dexter, of speaking before me. I know that my husband had a first wife, and I know how miserably she died. I have read the Trial." "You have read the life and death of a martyr!" cried Miserrimus Dexter. He suddenly wheeled his chair my way. He bent over me, his eyes filled with tears. "Nobody appreciated her at her true value," he said, "but me. Nobody but me. Nobody but me." Mrs. Macallan walked away impatiently to the end of the room. "When you are ready, Valeria, I am," she said. "We cannot keep the servants and the horses waiting much longer in this bleak place." I was too deeply interested in leading Miserrimus Dexter to pursue the subject on which he had touched to be willing to leave him at that moment. I pretended not to have heard Mrs. Macallan. I laid my hand, as if by accident, on the wheel chair to keep him near me. "You showed me how highly you esteemed that poor lady in your evidence at the Trial," I said. "I believe, Mr. Dexter, you have ideas of your own about the mystery of her death." He had been looking at my hand resting on the arm of his chair until I ventured on my question. At that he suddenly raised his eyes, and fixed them with a frowning and furtive suspicion on my face. "How do you know I have ideas of my own?" he asked, sternly. "I know it from reading the Trial," I answered. "The lawyer who cross examined you spoke almost in the very words which I have just said. I had no intention of offending you, Mr. Dexter." His face cleared as rapidly as it had clouded. He smiled, and laid his hand on mine. His touch struck me cold. I felt every nerve in me shivering under it. I drew my hand away quickly. "I beg your pardon," he said, "if I have misunderstood you. I have ideas of my own about that unhappy lady." He paused, and looked at me in silence very earnestly. "Have you any ideas?" he asked. "Ideas about her life, or about her death?" I was deeply interested. I was burning to hear more. It might encourage him to speak, if I were candid with him. I answered, "Yes." "Ideas which you have mentioned to any one?" he went on. "To no living creature," I replied, "as yet." "This is very strange," he said, still earnestly reading my face. "What interest can you have in a dead woman whom you never knew? Why did you ask me that question just now? Have you any motive in coming here to see me?" I boldly acknowledged the truth. I said, "I have a motive." "Is it connected with Eustace Macallan's first wife?" "It is." "With anything that happened in her lifetime?" "No." "With her death?" "Yes." He suddenly clasped his hands with a wild gesture of despair, and then pressed them both on his head, as if he were struck by some sudden pain. "I can't hear it to night," he said. "I would give worlds to hear it, but I daren't. I should lose all hold over myself in the state I am in now. I am not equal to raking up the horror and the mystery of the past. I have not courage enough to open the grave of the martyr I did. Did you hear me when you came here? I have an immense imagination. It runs riot at times. It makes an actor of me. I play the parts of all the heroes that ever lived. I feel their characters. I merge myself in their individualities. For the time I am the man I fancy myself to be. I can't help it. I am obliged to do it. If I restrained my imagination when the fit is on me, I should go mad. I let myself loose. It lasts for hours. It leaves me with my energies worn out, with my sensibilities frightfully acute. Rouse any melancholy or terrible association in me, at such times, and I am capable of hysterics. I am capable of screaming. You heard me scream. You shall not see me in hysterics. No, Mrs. Valeria, no, you innocent reflection of the dead and gone, I would not frighten you for the world. Will you come here to morrow in the daytime? I have got a chaise and a pony. Ariel, my delicate Ariel, can drive. She shall call at Mamma McKellen's and fetch you. We will talk to morrow, when I am fit for it. I am dying to hear you. I will be fit for you in the morning. I will be civil, intelligent, communicative, in the morning. No more of it now. Away with the subject the too exciting, the too interesting subject. I must compose myself, or my brains will explode in my head. Music is the true narcotic for excitable brains. My harp! My harp!" He rushed away in his chair to the far end of the room, passing Mrs. Macallan, as she returned to me, bent on hastening our departure. "Come!" said the old lady, irritably. "You have seen him, and he has made a good show of himself. More of him might be tiresome. Come away." The chair returned to us more slowly. Miserrimus Dexter was working it with one hand only. In the other he held a harp of a pattern which I had hitherto only seen in pictures. The strings were few in number, and the instrument was so small that I could have held it easily on my lap. It was the ancient harp of the pictured muses and the legendary Welsh bards. "Good night, Dexter," said Mrs. Macallan. He held up one hand imperatively. "Wait," he said. "Let her hear me sing." He turned to me. "I decline to be indebted to other people for my poetry and my music," he went on. "I compose my own poetry and my own music. I improvise. Give me a moment to think. I will improvise for you." He closed his eyes, and rested his head on the frame of the harp. His fingers gently touched the strings while he was thinking. In a few minutes he lifted his head, looked at me, and struck the first notes the prelude to the song. It was wild, barbaric, monotonous music, utterly unlike any modern composition. Sometimes it suggested a slow and undulating Oriental dance. Sometimes it modulated into tones which reminded me of the severer harmonics of the old Gregorian chants. The words, when they followed the prelude, were as wild, as recklessly free from all restraint of critical rules, as the music. They were assuredly inspired by the occasion. I was the theme of the strange song. And thus, in one of the finest tenor voices I ever heard, my poet sang of me: "Why does she come? She reminds me of the lost, she reminds me of the dead. In her form like the other, in her walk like the other. Why does she come? Does destiny bring her? Shall we range together the mazes of the past? Shall we search together the secrets of the past? Shall we interchange thoughts, surmises, suspicions? Does destiny bring her? The future will show. Let the night pass, let the day come. I shall see into her mind, she will look into mine. The future will show." His voice sank. His fingers touched the string more and more feebly as he approached the last lines. The overwrought brain needed and took its reanimating repose. At the final words his eyes slowly closed. His head lay back on the chair. He slept with his arms around his harp, as a child sleeps hugging its last new toy. We stole out of the room on tiptoe, and left Miserrimus Dexter, poet, composer, and madman, in his peaceful sleep. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 26. More of my obstinacy. Ariel was downstairs in the shadowy hall, half asleep, half awake, waiting to see the visitors clear of the house. Without speaking to us, without looking at us, she led the way down the dark garden walk and locked the gate behind us. "Good night, Ariel," I called out to her over the paling. Nothing answered me but the tramp of her heavy footsteps returning to the house and the dull thump, a moment afterwards, of the closing door. The footman had thoughtfully lighted the carriage lamps. Carrying one of them to serve as a lantern, he lighted us over the wilds of the brick desert, and landed us safely in a path by the high road. "Well," said my mother in law, when we were comfortably seated in the carriage again, "you have seen Miserrimus Dexter, and I hope you are satisfied. I will do him the justice to declare that I never in all my experience saw him more completely crazy than he was to night. What do you say?" "I don't presume to dispute your opinions," I answered. "But, speaking for myself, I am not quite sure that he is mad." "Not mad!" cried Mrs. Macallan. "After those frantic performances in his chair? Not mad after the exhibition he made of his unfortunate cousin? Not mad after the song that he sang in your honor, and the falling asleep by way of conclusion? Oh, Valeria, Valeria, well said the wisdom of our ancestors, 'There are none so blind as those who won't see.'" "Pardon me, dear Mrs. Macallan. I saw everything that you mentioned, and I never felt more surprised or more confounded in my life. But now I have recovered from my amazement, and can think it over quietly, I must still venture to doubt whether this strange man is really mad in the true meaning of the word. It seems to me that he only expresses, I admit in a very reckless and boisterous way, thoughts and feelings which most of us are ashamed of as weaknesses, and which we keep to ourselves accordingly. I confess I have often fancied myself transformed into some other person, and have felt a certain pleasure in seeing myself in my new character. One of our first amusements as children, if we have any imagination at all, is to get out of our own characters, and to try the characters of other personages as a change, to fairies, to be queens, to be anything, in short, but what we really are. Mr. Dexter lets out the secret just as the child does, and if that is madness, he is certainly mad. But I noticed that when his imagination cooled down, he became Miserrimus Dexter again. He no more believed himself than we believed him to be Napoleon or Shakespeare. Besides, some allowance is surely to be made for the solitary, sedentary life that he leads. I am not learned enough to trace the influence of that life in making him what he is, but I think I can see the result in an overexcited imagination, and I fancy I can trace his exhibiting his power over the poor cousin, and his singing of that wonderful song, to no more formidable cause than in ordinary self-conceit. I hope the confession will not lower me seriously in your good opinion, but I must say I have enjoyed my visit, and, worse still, Miserrimus Dexter really interests me." "Does this learned discourse on Dexter mean that you are going to see him again?" asked Mrs. McKellen. "I don't know how I may feel about it tomorrow morning," I said; "but my impulse at this moment is decidedly to see him again. I had a little talk with him while you were away at the other end of the room, and I believe he really can be of use to me." "Of use to you in what?" interposed my mother in law. "In the one object which I have in view the object, dear Mrs. Macallan, which I regret to say you do not approve." "And you are going to take him into your confidence? To open your whole mind to such a man as the man we have just left?" "Yes, if I think of it to morrow, as I think of it to night. I dare say it is a risk, but I must run risks. I know I am not prudent; but prudence won't help a woman in my position, with my end to gain." Mrs. Macallan made no further remonstrance in words. She opened a capacious pocket in front of the carriage, and took from it a box of matches and a railway reading lamp. "You provoke me," said the old lady, "into showing you what your husband thinks of this new whim of yours. I have got his letter with me his last letter from Spain. You shall judge for yourself, you poor deluded young creature, whether my son is worthy of the sacrifice the useless and hopeless sacrifice which you are bent on making of yourself for his sake. Strike a light." I willingly obeyed her. Ever since she had informed me of Eustace's departure to Spain, I had been eager for more news of him for something to sustain my spirits, after so much that had disappointed and depressed me. Thus far, I did not even know whether my husband thought of me sometimes in his self imposed exile. As to his regretting already the rash act which had separated us, it was still too soon to begin hoping for that. The lamp having been lighted, and fixed in its place between the two front windows of the carriage, Mrs. Macallan produced her son's letter. There is no folly like the folly of love. It cost me a hard struggle to restrain myself from kissing the paper on which the dear hand had rested. "There," said my mother in law. "Begin on the second page the page devoted to you. Read straight down to the last line at the bottom, and in God's name come back to your senses, child, before it is too late." I followed my instructions, and read these words: "Can I trust myself to write of Valeria? I must write of her. Tell me how she is, how she looks, what she is doing. I am always thinking of her. Not a day passes but I mourn the loss of her. Oh, if she had only been contented to let matters rest as they were! Oh, if she had never discovered the miserable truth! She spoke of reading the Trial when I saw her last. Has she persisted in doing so? I believe I say this seriously, mother I believe the shame and the horror of it would have been the death of me if I had met her face to face when she first knew of the ignominy that I have suffered, of the infamous suspicion of which I have been publicly made the subject. Think of those pure eyes looking at a man who has been accused, and never wholly absolved, of the foulest and the vilest of all murders, and then think of what that man must feel if he have any heart and any sense of shame left in him. I sicken as I write of it. Does she still meditate that hopeless project? the offspring, poor angel, of her artless, unthinking generosity. Does she still fancy that it is in her powers to assert my innocence before the world? Oh, mother, if she does, use your utmost influence to make her give up the idea. Spare her the humiliation, the disappointment, the insult, perhaps, to which she may innocently expose herself. For her sake, for my sake, leave no means untried to attain this righteous, this merciful end. I send her no message. I dare not do it. Say nothing, when you see her, which can recall me to her memory. On the contrary, help her to forget me as soon as possible. The kindest thing I can do, the one atonement I can make to her, is to drop out of her life." With those wretched words it ended. I handed his letter back to his mother in silence. She said but little on her side. "If this doesn't discourage you," she remarked, slowly folding up the letter, "nothing will. Let us leave it there, and say no more." I made no answer. I was crying behind my veil. My domestic prospect looked so dreary; my unfortunate husband was so hopelessly misguided, so pitiably wrong. The one chance for both of us, and the one consolation for poor me, was to hold to my desperate resolution more firmly than ever. If I had wanted anything to confirm me in this view, and to arm me against the remonstrances of every one of my friends, Eustace's letter would have proved more than sufficient to answer the purpose. At least he had not forgotten me. He thought of me, and he mourned the loss of me every day of his life. That was encouragement enough for the present. "If Ariel calls for me in the pony chaise to-morrow," I thought to myself, "with Ariel I go." Mrs. Macallan set me down at Benjamin's door. I mentioned to her at parting (I stood sufficiently in awe of her to put it off till the last moment) that Miserrimus Dexter had arranged to send his cousin and his pony chaise to her residence on the next day; and I inquired, thereupon, whether my mother in law would permit me to call at her house to wait for the appearance of the cousin, or whether she would prefer sending the chaise on to Benjamin's cottage. I fully expected an explosion of anger to follow this bold avowal of my plans for the next day. The old lady agreeably surprised me. She proved that she had really taken a liking to me. She kept her temper. "If you persist in going back to Dexter, you certainly shall not go to him from my door," she said. "But I hope you will not persist. I hope you will awake a wiser woman to morrow morning." The morning came. A little before noon the arrival of the pony chaise was announced at the door, and a letter was brought in to me from Mrs. Macallan. "I have no right to control your movements," my mother in law wrote. "I sent the chaise to Mr. Benjamin's house, and I sincerely trust that you will not take your place in it. I wish I could persuade you, Valeria, how truly I am your friend. I have been thinking about you anxiously in the wakeful hours of the night. How anxiously, you will understand when I tell you that I now reproach myself for not having done more than I did to prevent your unhappy marriage. And yet, what more I could have done I don't really know. My son admitted to me that he was courting you under an assumed name, but he never told me what the name was, or who you were, or where your friends lived. Perhaps I ought to have taken measures to find this out. Perhaps, if I had succeeded, I ought to have interfered and enlightened you, even at the sacrifice of making an enemy of my own son. I honestly thought I did my duty in expressing my disapproval, and in refusing to be present at the marriage. Was I too easily satisfied? It is too late to ask. Why do I trouble you with an old woman's vain misgivings and regrets? My child, if you come to any harm, I shall feel indirectly responsible for it. It is this uneasy state of mind which sets me writing, with nothing to say that can interest you. Don't go to Dexter. The fear has been pursuing me all night that your going to Dexter will end badly. Write him an excuse. Valeria, I firmly believe you will repent it if you return to that house. Was ever a woman more plainly warned, more carefully advised, than I? And yet warning and advice were both thrown away on me. Let me say for myself that I was really touched by the kindness of my mother in law's letter, though I was not shaken by it in the smallest degree. As long as I lived, moved, and thought, my one purpose now was to make Miserrimus Dexter confide to me his ideas on the subject of Mrs. Eustace Macallan's death. To those ideas I looked as my guiding stars along the dark way on which I was going. I wrote back to Mrs. Macallan, as I really felt gratefully and penitently, and then I went out to the chaise. Chapter 27. 7 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 27. Mr. Dexter at Home. I found all the idle boys in the neighborhood collected around the pony chaise, expressing in the occult language of slang their high enjoyment and appreciation of the appearance of Ariel in her man's jacket and hat. The pony was fidgety; he felt the influence of the popular uproar. His driver sat, whip in hand, magnificently impenetrable to the gibes and jests that were flying around her. I said "Good morning" on getting into the chaise. Ariel only said "Gee up!" and started the pony. I made up my mind to perform the journey to the distant northern suburb in silence. It was evidently useless for me to attempt to speak, and experience informed me that I need not expect to hear a word fall from the lips of my companion. Experience, however, is not always infallible. After driving for half an hour in stolid silence, Ariel astounded me by suddenly bursting into speech. "Do you know what we are coming to?" she asked, keeping her eyes straight between the pony's ears. "No," I answered. "I don't know the road. What are we coming to?" "We are coming to a canal." "Well?" "Well, I have half a mind to upset you in the canal." This formidable announcement appeared to require some explanation. I took the liberty of asking for it. "Why should you upset me?" I inquired. "Because I hate you," was the cool and candid reply. "What have I done to offend you?" I asked next. "What do you want with the Master?" Ariel asked, in her turn. "Do you mean Mr. Dexter?" "Yes." "I want to have some talk with Mr. Dexter." "You don't. You want to take my place. You want to brush his hair and oil his beard instead of me, you wretch!" I now began to understand. The idea which Miserrimus Dexter had jestingly put into her head in exhibiting her to us on the previous night had been ripening slowly in that dull brain, and had found its way outward into words, about 15 hours afterwards, under the irritating influence of my presence. "I don't want to touch his hair or his beard," I said. "I leave that entirely to you." She looked around at me, her fat face flushing, her dull eyes dilating, with the unaccustomed effort to express herself in speech, and to understand what was said to her in return. "Say that again!" she burst out. "And say it slower this time." I said it again, and I said it slower. "Swear it!" she cried, getting more and more excited. I preserved my gravity the canal was just visible in the distance and swore it. "Are you satisfied now?" I asked. There was no answer. Her last resources of speech were exhausted. The strange creature looked back again straight between the pony's ears, emitted hoarsely a grunt of relief, and never more looked at me, never more spoke to me for the rest of the journey. We drove past the banks of the canal, and I escaped immersion. We rattled in our jingling little vehicle, through the streets and across the waste patches of ground, which I dimly remembered in the darkness, and which looked more squalid and more hideous than ever in the broad daylight. The chaise turned down a lane, too narrow for the passage of any larger vehicle, and stopped at a wall and a gate that were new objects to me. Opening the gate with her key, and leading the pony, Ariel introduced me to the back garden and yard of Miserrimus Dexter's rotten and rambling old house. The pony walked off independently to his stable with the chaise behind him. My silent companion led me through a bleak and barren kitchen, and along a stone passage. Opening a door at the end, she admitted me to the back of the hall, into which Mrs. McCallum and I had penetrated by the front entrance to the house. Here Ariel lifted a whistle which hung around her neck, and blew the shrill trilling notes, with the sound of which I was already familiar as the means of communication between Miserrimus Dexter and his slave. The whistling over, the slave's unwilling lips struggled into speech for the last time. "Wait till you hear the Master whistle," she said. "Then go upstairs." So! I was to be whistled for like a dog. And worse still, there was no help for it but to submit like a dog. Had Ariel any excuses to make? Nothing of the sort. She turned her shapeless back on me, and vanished into the kitchen region of the house. After waiting for a minute or two, and hearing no signal from the floor above, I advanced into the broader and brighter part of the hall, to look by daylight at the pictures which I had only imperfectly discovered in the darkness of the night. A painted inscription in many colors, just under the cornice of the ceiling, informed me that the works on the walls were the production of the all accomplished Dexter himself. Not satisfied with being poet and composer, he was painter as well. On one wall the subjects were described as "Illustration of the Passions"; on the other as "Episodes in the Life of the Wandering Jew." Chance speculators, like myself, were gravely warned, by means of the inscription, to view the pictures as efforts of pure imagination. "Persons who look for mere nature in works of art," the inscription announced, "are persons to whom Mr. Dexter does not address himself with the brush. He relies entirely on his imagination. Nature puts him out." Taking due care to dismiss all ideas of nature from my mind, to begin with, I looked at the pictures which represented the Passions first. Little as I knew critically of art, I could see that Miserrimus Dexter knew still less of the rules of drawing, color, and composition. His pictures were, in the strictest meaning of that expressive word, daubs. The diseased and riotous delight of the painter in representing horrors was, with certain exceptions to be hereafter mentioned, the only remarkable quality that I could discover in a series of his works. The first of the Passion pictures illustrated revenge. A corpse, in fancy costume, lay on the bank of a foaming river under the shade of a giant tree. An infuriated man, also in fancy costume, stood astride over the dead body, with his sword lifted to the lowering sky, and watched, with a horrid expression of delight, the blood of the man whom he had just killed dripping slowly in a procession of big red drops down the broad blade of his weapon. The next picture illustrated cruelty, in many compartments. In one I saw a disemboweled horse savagely spurred on by his rider at a bullfight. In another, an aged philosopher was dissecting a living cat, and gloating over his work. In a third, two pagans politely congratulated each other on the torture of two saints. One saint was roasting on a gridiron; the other, hung up to a tree by his heels, had been just skinned, and was not quite dead yet. Feeling no great desire, after these specimens, to look at any more of the illustrated Passions, I turned to the opposite wall to be instructed in the career of the Wandering Jew. Here a second inscription informed me that the painter considered the Flying Dutchman to be no other than the Wandering Jew, pursuing his interminable journey by sea. The marine adventures of this mysterious personage were the adventures chosen for representation by Dexter's brush. The first picture showed me a harbor on a rocky coast. A vessel was at anchor, with the helmsman singing on the deck. The sea in the offing was black and rolling; thunderclouds lay low on the horizon, split by broad flashes of lightning. In the glare of the lightning, heaving and pitching, appeared the misty form of the Phantom Ship approaching the shore. In this work, badly as it was painted, there were really signs of a powerful imagination, and even of a poetical feeling for the supernatural. The next picture showed the Phantom Ship, moored, to the horror and astonishment of the helmsman, behind the earthly vessel in the harbor. The Jew had stepped on shore. His boat was on the beach. His crew, little men with stony white faces, dressed in funereal black, sat in silent rows on the seats of the boat, with their oars in their lean long hands. The Jew, also in black, stood with his eyes and hands raised imploringly to the thunderous heaven. The wild creatures of land and sea, the tiger, the rhinoceros, the crocodile, the sea serpent, the shark, and the devil-fish, surrounded the accursed wanderer in a mystic circle, daunted and fascinated at the sight of him. The lightning was gone. The sky and sea had darkened to a great black blank. A faint and lurid light lighted the scene, falling downward from a torch brandished by an avenging spirit that hovered over the Jew on outspread vulture wings. Wild as the picture might be in its conception, there was a suggestive power in it which I confess strongly impressed me. The mysterious silence in the house, and my strange position at the moment, no doubt had their effect on my mind. While I was still looking at the ghastly composition before me, the shrill trilling sound of the whistle upstairs burst on the stillness. For the moment my nerves were so completely upset that I started with a cry of alarm. I felt a momentary impulse to open the door and run out. The idea of trusting myself alone with the man who had painted those frightful pictures actually terrified me. I was obliged to sit down on one of the hall chairs. Some minutes passed before my mind recovered its balance, and I began to feel like my own ordinary self again. The whistle sounded impatiently for the second time. I rose and ascended the broad flight of stairs which led to the first story. To draw back at the point which I had now reached would have utterly degraded me in my own estimation. Still, my heart did certainly beat faster than usual as I approached the door of the circular anteroom, and I honestly acknowledge that I saw my own imprudence just then in a singularly vivid light. There was a glass over the mantelpiece in the anteroom. I lingered for a moment, nervous as I was, to see how I looked in the glass. The hanging tapestry over the inner door had been left partially drawn aside. Softly as I moved, the dog's ears of Miserrimus Dexter caught the sound of my dress on the floor. The fine tenor voice, which I had last heard singing, called to me softly. "Is that Mrs. Valeria? Please don't wait there. Come in." I entered the inner room. The wheeled chair advanced to meet me, so slowly and so softly that I hardly knew it again. Miserrimus Dexter languidly held out his hand. His head inclined pensively to one side, his large blue eyes looked at me piteously. Not a vestige seemed to be left of the raging, shouting creature of my first visit, who was Napoleon at one moment and Shakespeare at another. Mr. Dexter of the morning was a mild, thoughtful, melancholy man, who only recalled Mr. Dexter of the night by the inveterate oddity of his dress. His jacket on this occasion was of pink quilted silk. The coverlet which hid his deformity matched the jacket in pale sea green satin, and, to complete these strange vagaries of costume, his wrists were actually adorned with massive bracelets of gold, formed on the severely simple models which have descended to us from ancient times. "How good of you to cheer and charm me by coming here!" he said, in his most mournful and most musical tones. "I have dressed expressly to receive you, in the prettiest clothes I have. Don't be surprised. Except in this ignoble and material 19th century, men have always worn precious stuffs and beautiful colors as well as women. 100 years ago, a gentleman in pink silk was a gentleman properly dressed. 1500 years ago, the patricians of the classic times wore bracelets exactly like mine. I despise the brutish contempt for beauty, and the mean dread of expense which degrade a gentleman's costume to black cloth, and limit a gentleman's ornaments to a finger ring, in the age I live in. I like to be bright and beautiful, especially when brightness and beauty come to see me. You don't know how precious your society is to me. This is one of my melancholy days. Tears rise unbidden to my eyes. I sigh and sorrow over myself. I languish for pity. Just think of what I am, a poor solitary creature, cursed with a frightful deformity. How pitiable! How dreadful! My affectionate heart wasted. My extraordinary talents useless and misapplied. Sad, sad, sad! Please pity me." His eyes were positively filled with tears tears of compassion for himself. He looked at me and spoke to me with the wailing, querulous entreaty of a sick child wanting to be nursed. I was utterly at a loss what to do. It was perfectly ridiculous, but I was never more embarrassed in my life. "Please pity me," he repeated. "Don't be cruel. I only ask a little thing. Pretty Mrs. Valeria, say you pity me." I said I pitied him, and I felt that I blushed as I did it. "Thank you," said Miserrimus Dexter, humbly. "It does me good. Go a little further. Pat my hand." I tried to restrain myself, but the sense of the absurdity at this last petition quite gravely addressed to me, remember was too strong to be controlled. I burst out laughing. Miserrimus Dexter looked at me with a blank astonishment which only increased my merriment. Had I offended him? Apparently not. Recovering from his astonishment, he laid his head luxuriously on the back of his chair, with the expression of a man who was listening critically to a performance of some sort. When I had quite exhausted myself, he raised his head and clapped his shapely white hands, and honored me with an encore. "Do it again," he said, still in the same childish way. "Marry, Mrs. Valeria, you have a musical laugh. I have a musical ear. Do it again." I was serious enough by this time. "I am ashamed of myself, Mr. Dexter," I said. "Pray forgive me." He made no answer to this. I doubt if he heard me. His variable temper appeared to be in course of undergoing some new change. He sat looking at my dress, as I supposed, with a steady and anxious attention, gravely forming his own conclusions, steadfastly pursuing his own train of thought.
"Mrs. Valeria," he burst out suddenly, "you are not comfortable in that chair." "Pardon me," I replied. "I am quite comfortable." "Pardon me," he rejoined. "There is a chair of Indian basket work at that end of the room which is much better suited to you. Will you accept my apologies if I am rude enough to allow you to fetch it for yourself? I have a reason." He had a reason! What new piece of eccentricity was he about to exhibit? I rose and fetched the chair. It was light enough to be quite easily carried. As I returned to him, I noticed that his eyes were strangely employed in what seemed to be the closest scrutiny of my dress. And, stranger still, the result of this appeared to be partly to interest and partly to distress him. I placed the chair near him, and was about to take my seat in it, when he sent me back again, on another errand, to the end of the room. "Oblige me indescribably," he said. "There is a hand screen hanging on the wall, which matches the chair. We are rather near the fire here. You may find the screen useful. Once more forgive me for letting you fetch it for yourself. Once more let me assure you that I have a reason." Here was his "reason" reiterated, emphatically reiterated, for the second time. Curiosity made me as completely the obedient servant of his caprices as Ariel herself. I fetched the hand screen. Returning with it, I met his eyes still fixed with the same incomprehensible attention on my perfectly plain and unpretending dress, and still expressing the same curious mixture of interest and regret. "Thank you 1,000 times," he said. "You have, quite innocently, wrung my heart. But you have not the less done me an inestimable kindness. Will you promise not to be offended with me if I confess the truth?" He was approaching his explanation. I never gave a promise more readily in my life. "I have rudely allowed you to fetch your chair and your screen for yourself," he went on. "My motive will seem a very strange one, I am afraid. Did you observe that I noticed you very attentively? Too attentively, perhaps?" "Yes," I said. "I thought you were noticing my dress." He shook his head, and sighed bitterly. "Not your dress," he said, "and not your face. Your dress is dark. Your face is still strange to me. Dear Mrs. Valeria, I wanted to see you walk." To see me walk! What did he mean? Where was that erratic mind of his wandering to now? "You have a rare accomplishment for an Englishwoman," he resumed. "You walk well. She walked well. I couldn't resist the temptation of seeing her again in seeing you. It was her movement, her sweet, simple, unsought grace, not yours, when you walked to the end of the room and returned to me. You raised her from the dead when you fetched the chair and the screen. Pardon me for making use of you. The idea was innocent, the motive was sacred. You have distressed and delighted me. My heart bleeds, and thanks you." He paused for a moment, and let his head droop on his breast, then suddenly raised it again. "Surely we were talking about her last night?" he said. "What did I say? What did you say? My memory is confused. I half remember, half forget. Please remind me. You are not offended with me, are you?" I might have been offended with another man not with him. I was far too anxious to find my way into his confidence, now that he had touched of his own accord on the subject of Eustace's first wife, to be offended with Miserrimus Dexter. "We were speaking," I answered, "of Mrs. Eustace Macallan's death, and we were saying to one another " He interrupted me, leaning forward eagerly in his chair. "Yes, yes!" he exclaimed. "And I was wondering what interest you could have in penetrating the mystery of her death. Tell me, confide in me, I am dying to know." "Not even you have a stronger interest in that subject than the interest that I feel," I said. "The happiness of my whole life to come depends on my clearing up the mystery." "Good God, why?" he cried. "Stop! I am exciting myself. I mustn't do that. I must have all my wits about me. I mustn't wander. The thing is too serious. Wait a minute." An elegant little basket was hooked on to one of the arms of his chair. He opened it, and drew out a strip of embroidery, partially finished, with the necessary materials for working a complete. We looked at each other across the embroidery. He noticed my surprise. "Women," he said, "wisely compose their minds, and help themselves to think quietly, by doing needlework. Why are men such fools as to deny themselves the same admirable resource the simple and soothing occupation which keeps the nerves steady and leaves the mind calm and free? As a man, I follow the woman's wise example, Mrs. Valeria. Permit me to compose myself." Gravely arranging his embroidery, this extraordinary being began to work with the patient and nimble dexterity of an accomplished needlewoman. "Now," said Miserrimus Dexter, "if you are ready, I am. You talk, I work. Please begin." I obeyed him, and began. End of Chapter 27. Number 28 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 28. In the Dark. With such a man as Miserrimus Dexter, and with such a purpose as I had in view, no half confidences were possible. I must either risk the most unreserved acknowledgment of the interests that I really had at stake, or I must make the best excuse that occurred to me for abandoning my contemplated experiment at the last moment. In my present critical situation, no such refuge as a middle course lay before me, even if I had been inclined to take it. As things were, I ran risks, and plunged headlong into my own affairs at starting. "Thus far you know little or nothing about me, Mr. Dexter," I said. "You are, as I believe, quite unaware that my husband and I are not living together at the present time." "Is it necessary to mention your husband?" he asked, coldly, without looking up from his embroidery, and without pausing in his work. "It is absolutely necessary," I answered. "I can explain myself to you in no other way." He bent his head and sighed resignedly. "You and your husband are not living together at the present time," he resumed. "Does that mean that Eustace has left you?" "He has left me, and has gone abroad." "Without any necessity for it?" "Without the least necessity." "Has he appointed no time for his return to you?" "If he persevere in his present resolution, Mr. Dexter, Eustace will never return to me." For the first time he raised his head from his embroidery, with a sudden appearance of interest. "Is the quarrel so serious as that?" he asked. "Are you free of each other, pretty Mrs. Valeria, by common consent of both parties?" The tone in which he put the question was not at all to my liking. The look he fixed on me was a look which unpleasantly suggested that I had trusted myself alone with him, and that he might end in taking advantage of it. I reminded him quietly, by my manner more than by my words, of the respect which he owed to me. "You are entirely mistaken," I said. "There is no anger, there is not even a misunderstanding between us. Our parting has cost bitter sorrow, Mr. Dexter, to him and to me." He submitted to be set right with ironical resignation. "I am all attention," he said, threading his needle. "Pray go on. I won't interrupt you again." Acting on this invitation, I told him the truth about my husband and myself quite unreservedly, taking care, however, at the same time, to put Eustace's motives in the best light that they would bear. Miserrimus Dexter dropped his embroidery on his lap, and laughed softly to himself, with an impish enjoyment of my poor little narrative, which set every nerve in me on edge as I looked at him. "I see nothing to laugh at," I said, sharply. His beautiful blue eyes rested on me with a look of innocent surprise. "Nothing to laugh at?" he repeated. "In such an exhibition of human folly as you have just described?" His expression suddenly changed, his face darkened and hardened very strangely. "Stop!" he cried, before I could answer him. "There can be only one reason for your taking it as seriously as you do. Mrs. Valeria, you are fond of your husband." "Fond of him isn't strong enough to express it," I retorted. "I love him with my whole heart." Miserrimus Dexter stroked his magnificent beard and contemplatively repeated my words. "You love him with your whole heart. Do you know why?" "Because I can't help it," I answered doggedly. He smiled satirically, and went on with his embroidery. "Curious," he said to himself. "Eustace's first wife loved him too. There are some men whom the women all like, and there are other men whom the women never care for, without the least reason for it in either case. The one man is just as good as the other, just as handsome, as agreeable, as honorable, and as high in rank as the other; and yet for number one they will go through fire and water, and for number two they won't so much as turn their heads to look at him. Why? They don't know themselves, as Mrs. Valeria has just said. Is there a physical reason for it? Is there some potent magnetic emanation from number one which number two doesn't possess? I must investigate this when I have the time, and when I find myself in the humor." Having so far settled the question to his own entire satisfaction, he looked up at me again. "I am still in the dark about you and your motives," he said. I am still as far as ever from understanding what your interest is in investigating that hideous tragedy at Gleninch. Clever Mrs. Valeria, please take me by the hand, and lead me into the light. You're not offended with me, are you? Make it up, and I will give you this pretty piece of embroidery when I have done it. I am only a poor solitary deformed wretch, with a quaint turn of mind. I mean no harm. Forgive me, indulge me, enlighten me." He resumed his childish ways; he recovered his innocent smile, with the odd little puckers and wrinkles accompanying it at the corners of his eyes. I began to doubt whether I might not have been unreasonably hard on him. I penitently resolved to be more considerate toward his infirmities of mind and body during the remainder of my visit. "Let me go back for a moment, Mr. Dexter, to past times at Gleninch," I said. "You agree with me in believing Eustace to be absolutely innocent of the crime for which he was tried? Your evidence at the trial tells me that." He paused over his work, and looked at me with a grave and stern attention which presented his face in quite a new light. "That is our opinion," I resumed. "But it was not the opinion of the jury. Their verdict, you remember, was not proven. In plain English, the jury who tried my husband declined to express their opinion, positively and publicly, that he was innocent. Am I right?" Instead of answering, he suddenly put his embroidery back in the basket, and moved the machinery of his chair so as to bring it close by mine. "Who told you this?" he asked. "I found it for myself in a book." Thus far his face had expressed steady attention, and no more. Now, for the first time, I thought I saw something darkly passing over him which betrayed itself to my mind as rising distrust. "Ladies are not generally in the habit of troubling their heads about dry questions of law," he said. "Mrs. Eustace McCallum the second, you must have some very powerful motive for turning your studies that way." "I have a very powerful motive, Mr. Dexter. My husband is resigned to the Scotch Verdict. His mother is resigned to it. His friends, so far as I know, are resigned to it." "Well?" "Well, I don't agree with my husband, or his mother, or his friends. I refuse to submit to the Scotch Verdict." The instant I said those words, the madness in him, which I had hitherto denied, seemed to break out. He suddenly stretched himself over his chair. He pounced on me, with a hand on each of my shoulders. His wild eyes questioned me fiercely, frantically, within a few inches of my face. "What do you mean?" he shouted, at the utmost pitch of his ringing and resonant voice. A deadly fear of him shook me. I did my best to hide the outward betrayal of it. By look and word, I showed him, as firmly as I could, that I resented the liberty he had taken with me. "Remove your hands, sir," I said, "and retire to your proper place." He obeyed me mechanically. He apologized to me mechanically. His whole mind was evidently still filled with the words that I had spoken to him, and still bent on discovering what those words meant. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I humbly beg your pardon. The subject excites me, frightens me, maddens me. You don't know what a difficulty I have in controlling myself. Never mind. Don't take me seriously. Don't be frightened at me. I am so ashamed of myself. I feel so small and so miserable at having offended you. Make me suffer for it. Take a stick and beat me. Tie me down in my chair. Call up Ariel, who is as strong as a horse, and tell her to hold me. Dear Mrs. Valeria, injured Mrs. Valeria, I'll endure anything in the way of punishment, if you will only tell me what you mean by not submitting to the Scotch Verdict." He backed his chair penitently as he made that entreaty. "Am I far enough away yet?" he asked, with a rueful look. "Do I still frighten you? I'll drop out of sight, if you prefer it, in the bottom of the chair." He lifted the sea green coverlet. In another moment he would have disappeared like a puppet in a show, if I had not stopped him. "Say nothing more, and do nothing more. I accept your apologies," I said. "When I tell you that I refuse to submit to the opinion of the Scotch jury, I mean exactly what my words express. That verdict has left a stain on my husband's character. He feels the stain bitterly. How bitterly, no one knows so well as I do. His sense of his degradation is the sense that has parted him from me. It is not enough for him that I am persuaded of his innocence. Nothing will bring him back to me, nothing will persuade Eustace that I think him worthy to be the guide and companion of my life, but the proof of his innocence, set before the jury which doubts it, and the public which doubts it to this day. He and his friends and his lawyers all despair of ever finding that proof now. But I am his wife, and none of you love him as I love him. I alone refuse to despair. I alone refuse to listen to reason. If God spare me, Mr. Dexter, I dedicate my life to the vindication of my husband's innocence. You are his old friend. I am here to ask you to help me." It appeared to be now my turn to frighten him. The color left his face. He passed his hand restlessly over his forehead, as if he were trying to brush some delusion out of his brain. "Is this one of my dreams?" he asked, faintly. "Are you a vision of the night?" "I am only a friendless woman," I said, "who has lost all that she loved and prized, and who is trying to win it back again." He began to move his chair nearer to me once more. I lifted my hand; he stopped the chair directly. There was a moment of silence. We sat watching one another. I saw his hands tremble as he laid them on the coverlet. I saw his face grow paler and paler, and his underlip drop. What dead and buried remembrances had I brought to life in him in all their olden horror? He was the first to speak again. "So this is your interest," he said, "in clearing up the mystery of Mrs. Eustace Macallan's death?" "Yes." "And you believe that I can help you?" "I do." He slowly lifted one of his hands, and pointed at me with his long forefinger. "You suspect somebody," he said. The tone in which he spoke was low and threatening. It warned me to be careful. At the same time, if I now shut him out of my confidence, I should lose the reward that might yet be to come, for all that I had suffered and risked at that perilous interview. "You suspect somebody," he repeated. "Perhaps," was all that I said in return. "Is the person within your reach?" "Not yet." "Do you know where the person is?" "No." He laid his head languidly on the back of his chair, with a trembling, low drawn sigh. Was he disappointed, or was he relieved? Or was he simply exhausted, in mind and body alike? Who could fathom him? Who could say? "Will you give me 5 minutes?" he asked, feebly and wearily, without raising his head. "You know already how any reference to events at Gleninch excites and shakes me. I shall be fit for it again, if you will kindly give me a few minutes to myself. There are books in the next room. Please excuse me." I at once retired to the circular antechamber. He followed me in his chair, and closed the door between us. Chapter 29.